The sky was softly blue, the airport bustled with people going back and forth, and the intercom droned steadily calling passengers to board their planes. No one knew that one of those flights that day would become a lesson for the entire aviation industry and for society as a whole to reflect upon. A well-dressed black man wearing a tailored navy blue suit walked slowly through the boarding gate. He was not in a hurry. He showed no signs of being unusual. But even though he did absolutely nothing, simply took his seat in first class, it was still seen as not right. A flight attendant approached. Suspicious eyes. A tense voice. She asked him to leave the seat. Not once. Not twice. But several times, even though his ticket was completely valid. Something wasn't right here. And then the phones began to record. Before we dive into the details, let me ask a question. Why is a black man sitting in first class considered a notable event? In today's video, I will tell you a true story, not just about a man and a boarding pass, but about a system, a society, and a turning point that forced a company to change from the ground up. This story has it all: injustice happening in silence. A moment of courage from a bystander, a media storm, and an ending you will never forget. If you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever witnessed injustice and didn't know what to do, if you've ever thought, what can just one person really change, then this story's for you. Stay with me until the end of this video, because you're not just watching a story, you're witnessing how one ordinary person sparked extraordinary change. That day he arrived at the airport early. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't trying to draw attention. Wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, pulling a small suitcase, eyes calmly fixed on the boarding gate. To many, he was just another passenger. But to some, his presence caused a pause. Not because he was too conspicuous, but because he didn't fit the expected mold, especially as he walked toward first class. This wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. And it certainly wasn't new for those who live in the gray space between being accepted and being suspected just because of their appearance, their skin color, or the way they walk through a space not originally designed for them. In the U.S., hundreds of incidents occur every year in which black passengers are more thoroughly checked, asked to move seats, or questioned about their tickets even though they have done nothing wrong. Some stories are never told because the people involved choose silence to avoid trouble. But that day he did not stay silent, nor did he raise his voice. He just sat there calmly, just as he had walked onto the plane. The story began with a simple act, sitting in his rightful seat. But sometimes it is precisely these quiet actions that shake an entire system. Because if you don't look like what others expect a first-class passenger to be, you can become a problem in a matter of minutes, even if you've done nothing wrong. And that forces us to ask ourselves, why is a black man in a suit considered suspicious? Why do we still react this way, even if we never say it out loud? Not everyone gets to walk into high-end spaces with ease. Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove they're worthy, even though they've paid like everyone else. But the story didn't end there. Because right after he sat down, a voice rang out cold and sharp. And that's when the mask of professional service began to crack. "Excuse me, sir, can I see your boarding pass?" The voice came from right beside him, not gentle, not polite as it usually would be, but commanding, doubting. He looked up. A flight attendant, expressionless face, stern eyes, standing straight with arms folded. The small name tag on her chest gleamed under the cabin lights. But there was no smile on that face. He handed over his boarding pass politely. She looked at it, then frowned. "No, thank you. No, all clear." Just a furrowed brow, then a sharp, "It seems this isn't your seat." We often think power comes from titles, but in truth, power comes from how people use their voice. And that day, the flight attendant's voice carried not just authority, but prejudice. She checked no one else's seat in that section. Only his, the only black man in the cabin. And that was no coincidence. There's a term in U.S. customer service called selective scrutiny. It means employees may unconsciously scrutinize certain customers more closely if they don't seem to belong. An elderly woman in first class dressed modestly, a young person with a backpack in the priority lane, or a black man in a suit like him. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and certainly not the last. In 2019, for instance, a black doctor in Florida was asked to leave business class because she didn't look like someone with a real ticket, even though she had shown both her ticket and ID. The airline later issued a public apology, but the feeling of being doubted couldn't be erased. Back to that flight. Even after verifying the ticket, the flight attendant walked away without an apology, only to return a few minutes later now, more aggressive. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy. If you don't, I'll call security." He remained calm. Still, no shouting, no arguing. Just one simple reply. "This is the seat I paid for. I'm not going anywhere." And that's when things began to spiral out of control. Because power, when unchecked by reason, can quickly become a weapon of emotion. Those in authority aren't always right, and those who stay silent aren't always wrong. Some passengers began to notice. Phones were raised, eyes met silently across the cabin. Then someone stood up to defend him. "Excuse me, but he hasn't done anything wrong." A passenger from across the aisle spoke up. A simple sentence, but it rang like a bell in the quiet space. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Her phone was still recording, and now the eyes in the cabin shifted from the silent man to the increasingly agitated woman in uniform. No one expected a peaceful flight to become a social drama, but when power is abused, even the most ordinary moments become extraordinary. A voice from the back spoke up, "I've been watching. He hasn't done anything." Another whispered, "This is really unfair." Someone tapped away on their phone, clearly sharing the video. Just like that, it was no longer a matter between a passenger and a flight attendant. It became a story for the entire cabin. There's a psychological phenomenon called social proof. People tend to act when they see others speaking up for what's right. We often remain silent until someone says what we've been thinking. And in that moment, the wall of silence breaks piece by piece until the truth can no longer be hidden. In a first-class cabin, usually known for silence and discretion, that day was filled with quiet murmurs of protest. People began filming. Someone sent the clip to a friend who worked in media. Someone simply looked at the man and nodded. No slogans, no protests. Just a shared glance enough to create a ripple. These small actions, each phone raised, each voice speaking out, they are how justice quietly finds its way when no one expects it. You don't have to be the loudest to create change. You just have to be the first to stand up for what's right. The flight attendant, now visibly flustered, returned with a supervisor. But this time the supervisor didn't immediately side with her version of the story. He held a tablet, reviewed the ticket, the manifest, and met the passenger's gaze. And when he said the ticket is completely valid, he's in the right seat, the air in the cabin seemed to exhale something heavy. But the story didn't end there. Because some people, when proven wrong, don't stop. And from here, authority began to morph into bruised ego. The supervisor stepped forward with a calm face. Not angry, not in a rush. Just the seriousness of someone who had seen more complications than the miles he'd flown. The supervisor, the final voice of the crew. He looked through the flight info passenger name, seat number, then softly said, "His ticket is valid. This is his seat." Flight attendant Linda stood next to him. Her face flushed slightly, but instead of stepping back, she retorted, "I already checked. Maybe the system's wrong. Or maybe he's mistaken." Her voice no longer one of service. It was one grasping for pride. The supervisor didn't raise his voice. He simply said, just loud enough for both of them to hear, "We are in the service industry, and service cannot be based on intuition." A sentence that sounded light but hit heavier than any criticism. This was the moment when truth collided with the system and a choice had to be made. There's something not easy to accept in the service industry. Sometimes insiders are wrong, and when that happens, a company has two choices. 1. Protect its own and save face. 2. Accept fault and stand by the customer. Many organizations choose the first route. They hide mistakes behind press releases, use vague phrases like an unfortunate misunderstanding. But sometimes it's those very defenses that erode trust, not the original error. We've seen this before. Like the United Airlines incident in 2017 when an Asian American doctor was violently dragged off a plane for being overbooked. At first, the airline said the crew had followed protocol. But when the video went viral and public outrage grew, only then did they apologize. If only they had protected the passenger from the start, the damage could have been much less. Back to the flight, the supervisor made the right call. He didn't defend Linda. He defended the truth. And with one simple decision, he stopped the airline from falling deeper into the wrong. When the system is wrong, courage isn't about defending your team at all costs, it's about having the strength to correct it in time. But not everyone knows how to stop at the right moment. For Linda, the supervisor's confirmation didn't humble her. It made her feel betrayed. And from that moment on, it wasn't about passenger error or system glitch anymore. It became a personal battle between pride and reason. He still sat there, unmoved, unangry. He simply turned the page of the book he had been reading as if nothing outside could shake the peace inside his mind. People often think power comes from volume, from arguing, protesting, or commanding attention. But sometimes the strongest form of power comes from composure, from the way you don't react. In a world that expects you to lose control, Linda returned her expression more rigid. You're causing a disturbance. I'll be reporting this to the lead and ground staff. Still the same look, a mix of anger and injured pride. But he simply responded, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just sitting in the seat I paid for. A gentle reply, but it rendered all accusations pointless. And then the miracle began, not on paper, not in policy documents, but in the eyes of the other passengers. The woman recording looked at him with respect. The man behind him gave a slight nod. Even those who had been silent now began to believe who was truly in the right. In psychology, there's a concept called moral gravity, the idea that someone who is calm, kind, and publicly mistreated naturally draws deep empathy. They don't need to call for allies. They don't need slogans. They just need to stand firm in their rightness, and the rest will follow. We've seen this in history. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't carry weapons, didn't slam fists. He simply stood and spoke in a calm, deep voice, and a whole generation followed. Or Rosa Parks, the woman who simply refused to give up her bus seat. She didn't shout, but that quiet defiance changed the laws of a nation. And that day in the first-class cabin of a commercial flight, he was doing something similar. Not for attention, not to go viral, just refusing to leave when he'd done nothing wrong. Calmness is not weakness. Calmness is the choice of the strong when they know the truth always speaks for itself. Linda was different. With every refusal, she seemed to lose more control. She wasn't serving the customer anymore. She was trying to reclaim control for herself. And when ego overtakes reason, she reached for the final option that every flight attendant knows is dangerous. From the moment the phone was raised to record the truth was no longer confined to that cabin. It had started to travel further, beyond that flight path, beyond the threat of, I'll call security. Inside the cabin, things calmed. But outside in messages and group chats and the first few Instagram stories, a wave was forming. The video was less than a minute long. No edits, no background music. Just the ambient cabin sounds, tense dialogue, and a raw moment that couldn't be ignored. But sometimes it's exactly these breathlessly real moments that make the world stop and look. The woman recording texted her friend, you need to see this. She's harassing this man for just sitting in first class. Another friend reposted it on Twitter, then Reddit, then TikTok. Within hours of landing, the clip had hundreds of thousands of views. And just like that, justice began to find its own way through Wi-Fi, through hashtags, through the hands of people who had no official power, except a phone. There's a term in the digital age called accountability by virality. When a system can't respond fast enough, the internet becomes the voice of justice. Good or bad, depending on how it's used. But in cases like this, it becomes the only weapon truth has to defend itself. We've seen this happen many times. The story of Christian Cooper, the black man, who was falsely reported to the police by a white woman just for birdwatching in Central Park. The video forced her to face consequences. Or the case of a university student denied access to his own dorm building because he didn't look like someone who lived there. Just hours later, the school board had to issue a public apology and revise their entry policy. Back on that flight attendant, Linda probably didn't realize that every word she spoke, every frown she made, was now being witnessed by a global audience. Not just a cabin, but millions of people who had never met her but were watching her and would remember, because the internet doesn't forget. It remembers both right and wrong, and for some it's the first time they've ever had a voice. But for others, it's a mirror that reflects more clearly than they'd ever wish. You never know who's watching. So live as though every action is public, because in this age, sometimes it is. While the video kept spreading, the story was now reaching the people who held real authority. Not Linda, not the supervisor, but operations managers, the communications team, and the cockpit. A short message was sent from ground control to the plane. There's a complaint of discrimination. There's video, potential PR crisis. And from that moment on, Linda was no longer the one in control of the situation. She stood still in the galley. The glass in her hand trembled, water having spilled over the rim at some unknown moment. Her face no longer showed firmness, only a visible confusion, as if she had lost something important, but couldn't name it. Just minutes earlier, she had believed she was right, that she was doing her job keeping order on the flight. But now she wasn't so sure. Each time the supervisor spoke through the radio, each glance from the passengers, each time she overheard someone whisper about that clip going viral, all of it gently chipped away at her pride until it cracked. Linda was not a bad person. She had once been commended for her dedication, had helped an elderly man through a panic attack in midair, had once prevented a stroke in time. But it was precisely because she thought she was basically good that she couldn't see one crucial truth. Prejudice doesn't need to be intentional to cause harm. In psychology, there's a term implicit bias. It refers to unconscious prejudice formed from life experiences, media education. And the problem is those who carry it usually don't know they do. Linda didn't wake up that morning intending to discriminate. She simply saw someone who didn't match her mental image of a first-class passenger, and her brain automatically labeled him suspicious. No one told her to do that. But society, media, and the times she'd been praised as sharp had unconsciously reinforced it. This story isn't just about Linda. It's about all of us people who can treat others unfairly with just a look and never even realize it. In 2016, a professor at Yale University sent the exact same email asking for advice to two groups of faculty. The only difference, one sender had a white-sounding name, the other had a black-sounding name. The result: the white-sounding name received 3 times more responses, even though the content was identical. None of the respondents thought they were being biased, but the truth doesn't need intention to exist. Linda now sat slumped in the galley. She knew the situation was no longer in her hands. The video was being shared, the media might already be involved, and she, someone who once took pride in her professionalism, was now facing consequences. For the first time, she wasn't sure she was still a symbol of service. No one is immune to bias, but the brave are those who dare to recognize it and correct it before it's too late. And while Linda faced a confusion she'd never felt before, elsewhere on the same flight, the man sat quietly looking out the window. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew what he needed to do wasn't over yet. In a quiet office thousands of miles from the airport, the pale blue light of a computer screen lit up the tense faces of airline executives. A video replayed, no soundtrack, no dramatic narration, just the hum of a cabin, sharp voices, and a clear image of a moment they could no longer ignore. The black man, sitting still, surrounded by accusations, surrounded by stares, and now millions watching him through the tiny screens in their pockets. In emergency meetings that followed, no one used the words minor issue. No one said we'll conduct an internal review as a knee-jerk response, because this time the matter had left the internal realm. The story had become news, had become a symbol, and most importantly, it had become a challenge to the very identity of the brand. Every company, sooner or later, faces a moment like this, a crossroads of trust where they must choose between preserving the old image or rebuilding from the ground up. Some companies choose to go silent, issue vague apologies, blame it on individual error, wait for the media storm to pass, and then business as usual until the next incident. But some brands choose to turn crisis into a catalyst for reform, like Starbucks in 2018 after 2 black men were asked to leave the cafe for waiting for a friend. The company didn't just apologize, they closed over 8,000 stores for a day to conduct bias training for all staff. That wasn't PR damage control. That was a declaration, we're ready to change from the roots. Now, the airline in this story stood before the same choice. Executives began asking, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Is our corporate culture silently enabling bias that no one sees? And most importantly, Will we dare to change? Even after the spotlight fades, someone proposed retraining the entire crew. Another suggested forming a passenger advisory board, bringing in customers from diverse backgrounds to provide real feedback. Not quarterly, not yearly, but after each specific incident. This was no longer crisis management. It was the first step in collective self-reflection. Saying sorry may ease the public, but only action can ease the heart. And while the boardrooms drew up reform plans, the man in the story remained silent. He didn't post the clip, didn't go to the press, didn't file a lawsuit. He simply waited. Because he knew if promises weren't followed by actions, then change was just a shell. And if that happened, he'd be back at the table not to demand compensation, but to insist on what he believed we all deserve. When the plane landed, passengers began gathering their belongings, lining up to disembark. But he remained seated, not hurried, not avoiding eye contact, because he knew this was truly just the beginning. An airline representative met him at the gate, apologized, offered assistance, invited him to the lounge for a private conversation. He nodded calmly, following without anger, without resentment, exactly as he had boarded the flight, composed, assured. At the lounge, he was offered tea, water, complimentary Wi-Fi, everything an airline could think of to ease a situation. But he didn't come for tea. He came to ask the question none of them dared to answer clearly. If today I hadn't stayed calm, if no one had recorded the video, if I were someone quieter, more tired, more powerless, how would this have ended? No one said a word, because they knew it still happens somewhere every day. It's just that not every moment has a camera, and not everyone mistreated has the strength to speak up. He didn't accept compensation. He didn't demand lifetime upgrades. He didn't ask for symbolic gestures. Instead, he asked for something that seemed simple, yet was far harder. I want to see a plan for change, specific, with a timeline, with accountability. Not for me, but for those who never got the chance to speak. That's when they realized he wasn't a victim. He was a spark of a needed transformation. His story reminded us of those who stood up not for fame, but for principle. Erin Brockovich, the woman without a law degree who took on a major water company for poisoning an entire town. Claudette Colvin, the 15-year-old student who refused to give up her bus seat before Rosa Parks and was arrested even though history books forgot her name. They didn't step into the fight to be famous. They just refused to bow their heads. Sometimes you don't need to be the one who creates the storm. You just need to be the one who lights the first spark. After the conversation, he left. No promise to return, no threat of lawsuits, no further demands. But he left behind an email address and a message: I'd like to be informed of the next steps. Not for me, but to know if you're truly serious. And on the other end of the system, a team was urgently compiling reports, restructuring procedures, drafting a long-term plan, because they knew if they didn't act, that man wouldn't stay silent forever. A few weeks later, he boarded a plane again, also in first class, also down the quiet corridor under the soft golden glow across the armrest. But this time, no one questioned his ticket. A flight attendant smiled, welcomed him with sincerity in her eyes. One of them leaned closer and whispered, "I know what happened. I'm very sorry. We're being retrained because of you." He simply nodded gently, said nothing more. Because sometimes, silence is the clearest way to acknowledge progress. In the months that followed, the airline announced a new training program on unconscious bias for all staff. They established the Passenger Advisory Board, as he had proposed, bringing in diverse voices from across communities to help shape a new service culture. And for the first time in years, they published an internal code of conduct pledge, not for marketing, but to remind themselves. Not everyone believed right away. Not everything changed overnight. But the important thing was something had been set in motion. From a quiet moment, a calm gaze in the middle of a storm, a whole organization began learning to look inward. We, the ones watching this video, may have never flown first class, may have never been treated unfairly in an obvious way. But one day, you will walk into a room and someone will look at you like you don't belong. And in that moment, you'll remember there was once a man who sat still, who didn't leave, didn't get angry. He simply held his ground, which he had rightfully earned. And from that calm, an entire system began to change. Justice doesn't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes it begins with a person choosing not to stand up just to affirm they deserve to stay. Because in the end, this isn't just the story of a man on a plane. It's ours, those of us living in a world still full of invisible boundaries. And every time someone stands up or stays seated for what's right, the world shifts ever so slightly toward justice. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story touched you, share it. Because who knows? You might be the one to light the next spark for change. Every small action, a glance, a word of support, a quick video can lead to big change. And if you've ever thought I'm just one ordinary person, can I really make a difference? Then this story is your answer. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed similar injustice? What would you do if you were on that flight? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit like, share it with friends, because everyone deserves to hear about kindness, courage, and the power to create change. And if you want to continue following real moving and thought-provoking stories like this one, subscribe so you don't miss the next journey, because every story is a reminder that no matter who we are or where we are, we can always make the world better one step at a time.